The Camino de Santiago, also known by the English names Way of St. James, St. James's Way, St. James's Path, St. James's Trail, Route of Santiago de Compostela, and Road to Santiago, is the name of any of the pilgrimage routes, known as pilgrim ways, to the shrine of the Apostle St. James the Great in the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela in Galicia in northwestern Spain, where tradition has it that the remains of the saint are buried. Many take up this route as a form of spiritual path or retreat for their spiritual growth. Major Christian pilgrimage route. The Way of St. James was one of the most important Christian pilgrimages during the Middle Ages, together with those to Rome and Jerusalem, and a pilgrimage route on which a plenary indulgence could be earned. Other major pilgrimage routes include the Via Francigena to Rome and the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Legend holds that St. James's remains were carried by boat from Jerusalem to northern Spain, where he was buried on what is now the city of Santiago de Compostela. The way can take one of dozens of pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela. Traditionally, as with most pilgrimages, the Way of St. James began at one's home and ended at the pilgrimage site. However, a few of the routes are considered main ones. During the Middle Ages, the route was highly traveled. However, the Black Death, the Protestant Reformation, and political unrest in 16th-century Europe led to its decline. By the 1980s, only a few pilgrims per year arrived in Santiago. Later, the route attracted a growing number of modern-day pilgrims from around the globe. In October 1987, the route was declared the first European cultural route by the Council of Europe. It was also named one of UNESCO's World Heritage Sites. Whenever St. James's Day falls on a Sunday, the cathedral declares a Holy or Jubilee year. Depending on leap years, holy years occur in 5, 6, and 11-year intervals. The most recent were 1982, 1993, 1999, 2004, and 2010. The next will be 2021, 2027, and 2032. History. The pilgrimage to Santiago has never ceased from the time of the discovery of St. James's remains, though there have been years of fewer pilgrims, particularly during European wars. Pre-Christian history. The main pilgrimage route to Santiago follows an earlier Roman trade route, which continues to the Atlantic coast of Galicia, ending at Cape Finisterre. Although it is known today that Cape Finisterre, Spain's westernmost point, is not the westernmost point of Europe. The fact that the Romans called it Finisterre indicates that they viewed it as such. At night, the Milky Way overhead seems to point the way, so the route acquired the nickname Voie lacteaqt, the Milky Way in French. Scallop symbol. The scallop shell, often found on the shores in Galicia, has long been the symbol of the Camino de Santiago. Over the centuries, the scallop shell has taken on mythical, metaphorical and practical meanings, even if its relevance may actually derive from the desire of pilgrims to take home a souvenir. Two versions of the most common myth about the origin of the symbol concern the death of St. James, who was martyred by beheading in Jerusalem in 44 AD. According to Spanish legends, he had spent time preaching the gospel in Spain, but returned to Judea upon seeing a vision of the Virgin Mary on the bank of the Ebro River. Version 1. After James's death, his disciples shipped his body to the Iberian Peninsula to be buried in what is now Santiago. Off the coast of Spain, a heavy storm hit the ship, and the body was lost to the ocean. After some time, however, it washed ashore undamaged, covered in scallops. Version 2. After James's death, his body was transported by a ship piloted by an angel, back to the Iberian Peninsula to be buried in what is now Santiago. As the ship approached land, a wedding was taking place on shore. The young groom was on horseback, and on seeing the ship approaching, his horse got spooked, and horse and rider plunged into the sea. Through miraculous intervention, the horse and rider emerged from the water alive, covered in seashells. The scallop shell also acts as a metaphor. The grooves in the shell, which meet at a single point, represent the various routes pilgrims traveled, eventually arriving at a single destination, the tomb of James in Santiago de Compostela. The shell is also a metaphor for the pilgrim. As the waves of the ocean wash scallop shells up onto the shores of Galicia, God's hand also guides the pilgrims to Santiago. As the symbol of the Camino de Santiago, the shell is seen very frequently along the trails. The shell is seen on posts and signs along the Camino in order to guide pilgrims along the way. The shell is even more commonly seen on the pilgrims themselves. Wearing a shell denotes that one is a traveler on the Camino de Santiago. Most pilgrims receive a shell at the beginning of their journey and either attach it to them by sewing it onto their clothes or wearing it around their neck or by simply keeping it in their backpack. The scallop shell also served practical purposes for pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago. The shell was the right size for gathering water to drink or for eating out of as a makeshift bowl. The pilgrim's staff is a walking stick used by pilgrims to the shrine of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Generally, the stick has a hook on it so that something may be hung from it, and may have a crosspiece on it. Medieval route. The pilgrim route is a very good thing, but it is narrow, for the road which leads us to life is narrow. On the other hand, the road which leads to death is broad and spacious. The pilgrim route is for those who are good. It is the lack of vices, the thwarting of the body, the increase of virtues, pardon for sins, sorrow for the penitent, the road of the righteous, love of the saints, faith in the resurrection and the reward of the blessed, a separation from hell, the protection of the heavens. It takes us away from luscious foods, it makes gluttonous fatness vanish, it restrains voluptuousness, constrains the appetites of the flesh which attack the fortress of the soul, cleanses the spirit, leads us to contemplation, humbles the haughty, raises up the lowly, loves poverty. It hates the reproach of those fueled by greed. It loves, on the other hand, the person who gives to the poor. It rewards those who live simply and do good works, and, on the other hand, it does not pluck those who are stingy and wicked from the claws of sin. Codex Calixtinus. The earliest records of visits paid to the shrine dedicated to Saint James at Santiago de Compostela date from the 9th century, in the time of the Kingdom of Asturias. The pilgrimage to the shrine became the most renowned medieval pilgrimage, and it became customary for those who returned from Compostela to carry back with them a Galician scallop shell as proof of their completion of the journey. This practice was gradually extended to other pilgrimages. The earliest recorded pilgrims from beyond the Pyrenees visited the shrine in the middle of the 11th century, but it seems that it was not until a century later that large numbers of pilgrims from abroad were regularly journeying there. The earliest records of pilgrims that arrived from England belong to the period between 1092 and 1105. However, by the early 12th century the pilgrimage had become a highly organized affair. One of the great proponents of the pilgrimage in the 12th century was Pope Calixtus II, who started the Compostelan Holy Years. The official guide in those times was the Codex Calixtinus. Published around 1140, the fifth book of the Codex is still considered the definitive source for many modern guidebooks. 4 pilgrimage routes listed in the Codex originate in France and converge at Puente la Reina. From there, a well-defined route crosses northern Spain, linking Burgos, Carrion de los Condes, Sahagún, Leon, Astorga, and Compostela. The daily needs of pilgrims on their way to and from Compostela were met by a series of hospitals and led to the development of the idea itself. They were often under royal protection and staffed by Catholic orders. Donations were encouraged, but many poorer pilgrims had little but the clothes on their backs. Romanesque architecture, a new genre of ecclesiastical architecture, was designed with massive archways to cope with huge devout crowds. There was also the sale of the now familiar paraphernalia of tourism, such as badges and souvenirs. since the Christian symbol for James the Greater was the scallop shell. Many pilgrims wore one as a sign to anyone on the road that they were a pilgrim. This gave them privileges to sleep in churches and ask for free meals, but also attempted to ward off thieves with limited success, thus needing another hospital in the next town. Pilgrims often prayed to Saint Roch, whose numerous depictions with the cross of St. James can be seen along the way even today. The pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela was possible because of the protection and freedom provided by the Kingdom of France, where the majority of pilgrims originated. Enterprising French settled in towns along the pilgrimage routes, where their names appear in the archives. The pilgrims were tended by people like Domingo de la Calzada, who was later recognized as a saint himself. Pilgrims walked the way of St. James, often for months, to arrive at the great church in the main square of Compostela and pay homage to St. James. So many pilgrims have laid their hands on the pillar just inside the doorway of the church that a groove has been worn in the stone. The popular Spanish name for the astronomical Milky Way is El Camino de Santiago. According to a common medieval legend, the Milky Way was formed from the dust raised by traveling pilgrims. Compostela itself means field of stars. Another origin for this popular name is Book IV of the Book of St. James, which relates how the saint appeared in a dream to Charlemagne, urging him to liberate his tomb from the Moors and showing him the direction to follow by the route of the Milky Way. As penance, the Church employed a system of rituals to atone for temporal punishment due to sins known as penance. According to this system, pilgrimages were a suitable form of expiation for some temporal punishment, and they could be used as acts of penance for those who were guilty of certain crimes, as noted in the Catholic Encyclopedia. In the registers of the Inquisition at Carcassonne, we find the four following places noted as being the centers of the greater pilgrimages to be imposed as penances for the graver crimes: the tomb of the Apostles at Rome, the shrine of St. James at Compostela, St. Thomas' body at Canterbury, and the relics of the Three Kings at Cologne. There is still a tradition in Flanders of pardoning and releasing one prisoner every year under the condition that this prisoner walks to Santiago, wearing a heavy backpack, accompanied by a guard. Enlightenment era. During the War of American Independence, John Adams was ordered by Congress to go to Paris to obtain funds for the cause. His ship started leaking and he disembarked with his two sons in Finisterre in 1779. From there he proceeded to follow the way of St. James in the reverse direction of the pilgrim's route, in order to get to Paris overland. He did not stop to visit Santiago, which he later came to regret. In his autobiography, Adams gave an accurate description of the customs and lodgings afforded to St. James's pilgrims in the 18th century, as well as mentioned the legend as it was then told to travelers. I have always regretted that we could not find time to make a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. We were informed that the original of this shrine and temple of St. Iago was this: a certain shepherd saw a bright light there in the night. Afterwards it was revealed to an archbishop that St. James was buried there. This laid the foundation of a church, and they have built an altar on the spot where the shepherd saw the light. In the time of the Moors, the people made a vow that if the Moors should be driven from this country, they would give a certain portion of the income of their lands to St. James. The Moors were defeated and expelled, and it was reported and believed that St. James was in the battle and fought with a drawn sword at the head of the Spanish troops, on horseback. The people, believing that they owed the victory to the saint, very cheerfully fulfilled their vows by paying the tribute. Upon the supposition that this is the place of the sepulchre of St. James, there are great numbers of pilgrims who visit it every year, from France, Spain, Italy and other parts of Europe, many of them on foot. Adams, a great-grandson. The historian Henry Adams later visited Leon, among other Spanish cities, during his trip through Europe as a youth, although he did not follow the entire pilgrimage route, and that particular book was published posthumously. Another Enlightenment-era traveler on the pilgrimage route was the naturalist Alexander von Humboldt.